During the company meeting, while the presentations were going on, I noticed something that should never have escaped the eyes of a man in love. The exchange of glances between the boss and my wife would be subtle to anyone, but to me, it was like a punch in the gut. My senses went on alert. Her laughs at her boss's comments were warmer, the looks lingered longer than necessary, and there was something about the way she adjusted her hair while he spoke that made me lose concentration on everything around me. My heart was pounding, my hands were sweating, but something inside me already knew. It wasn't paranoia, it wasn't exaggeration. There, in front of everyone, the truth seemed to unfold like an open page. And that was when, without even thinking, the words came out of my mouth like a roar of fury and pain. I found out everything about you. That exchange of looks doesn't fool me. I want a divorce now, and I'm going to sue this company. The silence in the room was deafening. All eyes, previously focused on the boss, were now on me. The meeting room, with its glass walls and the muffled sound of the air conditioning, became too small to contain the tension. My wife, next to me, opened her eyes wide. His lips tried to formulate a sentence, but nothing came. She knew. I knew. Everyone knew. As the boss adjusted his jacket and cleared his throat, trying to hide his nervousness, I noticed the expression on his face change. It wasn't just surprise, it was the despair of a man who had just been unmasked. He tried to intervene, but I didn't give him a chance. Don't say a word. I know everything. Every message, every meeting, every lie. My fists were clenched, my voice firm but broken with pain. The woman I loved, the person I built a life with, was now the protagonist of my greatest humiliation. I relived in seconds all the nights she came home late, the moments when her phone vibrated and she hid it as if it were something unimportant, the smiles faded when I looked into her eyes seeking answers she never gave. I remember the excuses. It's just work. He's my boss. You're exaggerating. For months, I swallowed suspicion, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But now, it was impossible to ignore. My wife, still in shock, finally tried to speak. Please, let's talk. You're getting it all wrong. His voice was shaking, but his face didn't hide his guilt. Every word she said felt like fuel for the fire that burned inside me. Wrong? Do you really think I'm getting it wrong? Maybe it was wrong to trust you. Maybe it was wrong to believe that what we had was enough. I turned to the boss. What about you? Do you think you can play with people's lives? Manipulate, destroy, and get away with it? This company is your fortress, but I'm going to take it down, stone by stone. The tension in the room was unbearable. No one dared to move or even breathe loudly. The boss, unable to hold my gaze, just remained silent. But I knew that behind that facade was a terrified man. And my wife. She seemed so small, so distant, as if she was already aware that all the excuses in the world couldn't erase what had been done. I left the room without looking back. Each step seemed to echo like a hammer in my heart. At that moment, it wasn't just anger that overwhelmed me, but an overwhelming sadness. My mind was buzzing with all the questions I knew would never have satisfactory answers. Why? Why does someone cheat? Why destroy the heart of someone who loves you? Back home, I sat in the living room, surrounded by the silence that was once welcoming but now felt oppressive. Everything there, the photos, the furniture, the details we built together, now seemed strange to me. Each thing felt like a reminder of what I was about to lose. But what hurt most was the uncertainty of what was to come. Would she come home? Would you try to justify yourself? What could she say to fix what was already broken? Hours later, I heard the door open. She entered slowly, as if stepping into enemy territory. His eyes were red, his face pale. I want to explain, he said, his voice barely audible. But I didn't want to hear it. There's nothing you can say that will change what happened, I replied, without even looking at her. Why did you do that? I just want to understand. She sat across from me, her hands shaking, and began to speak. I felt alone. You were always so busy, so distant. He made me feel special. His voice broke, and tears ran down his face. I know I made a mistake, but I never wanted to hurt you. Those words, so empty, so predictable, did nothing but intensify my pain. Special? I asked, my voice full of irony and bitterness. Special enough to destroy an entire life? To throw away years of trust and love? While she cried, my mind was elsewhere. I thought about how all of this could have been avoided. As the man I was, before I knew about the betrayal, would have done anything to protect her, to make her happy. But now, that man was dead, replaced by someone who could only feel anger and contempt. You and him. Did you two think you could hide this forever? That I would never find out? She shook her head, sobbing. It wasn't like that. It wasn't supposed to be like that. But I couldn't hear any more. Her every word was a knife that stabbed deeper. I'm going out, I said finally, standing up. I need time. I need to think. And you should do the same. Because when I come back, everything will be different. There are no more us. The tears on her face intensified, but I couldn't care anymore. The pain I felt was greater than anything I could imagine. I left the house, but the feeling of emptiness followed me. As I drove through the dark streets, my mind was a storm of emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion. What was left for me now? How could I rebuild my life from this point? And, more importantly, how would I face the consequences of this betrayal? These questions, unanswered, were all I had. But deep down, something told me that this wasn't the end. That there was more to come. That this story still had unexpected twists and hidden truths that would change everything I thought I knew. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support or romanticize any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, created to show how betrayal can devastate lives, hearts and families. Get ready, because what comes next is a narrative full of emotions, twists and profound lessons. Take a breath and settle in, you're about to hear a shocking story that will stick with you for a long time. Happy listening. Daniel and Clara were what many would call the perfect couple. Together for more than a decade, they had built a life that seemed exemplary to anyone who observed them. Daniel was a determined man, an engineer for a large company, known for his work ethic and dedication. Clara, in turn, was an administrator at a multinational, a woman with a striking presence and a charming smile, who always seemed to have control of the situation, no matter how chaotic it was. They had a spacious home, decorated with care that reflected their union, and a circle of friends who often praised them as the ideal couple. The relationship, however, was not always as idyllic as it seemed. In the beginning, there was a flame that seemed inextinguishable. They met at a university party, where Clara, with her blue dress that Daniel would never forget, stole the gaze of everyone in the room, but he was the one who had the courage to approach her. The first meeting was followed by long walks and conversations that lasted until dawn. The connection was palpable, something they both believed was rare. But, like everything in life, as the years passed and the routine continued, things began to change. Work was one of the first challenges for them. Clara, on the rise in her career, had to deal with frequent travel, late meetings, and the constant pressure of achieving goals. Daniel, who also carried the responsibilities of his profession, often found himself lost between trying to support his wife's career and his own ambition. Despite this, he never stopped being present at home, making a point of being available, even when tiredness was evident in his eyes. Clara appreciated that, or at least seemed to appreciate it. She always said that he was the foundation that kept everything standing, words that, for Daniel, were both a relief and a weight. The home they shared was the perfect reflection of who they were together and apart. Clara loved organization and planning, and Daniel was a practical man, who preferred functionality over aesthetics. The two had decorated every corner with their own touch, creating a space that told the story of their life together. The walls had photos of trips they took around the world, of their first years of marriage, of parties with friends. But recently, Daniel noticed that the photo albums stopped growing. He asked himself several times when was the last time they had done something spontaneous, something that rekindled that spark from their early years. Their social circle also began to change. Meetings with friends, which used to be a refuge for both, began to be just another obligation. Clara, with her natural charisma, seemed comfortable in any environment, while Daniel, increasingly introspective, saw himself as a spectator of his own life. He spent more time observing than interacting, capturing details that seemed insignificant to others but had enormous weight for him. In the company where Clara worked, she had always been admired, not only for her efficiency, but also for her attitude. There was a clear line between professionalism and camaraderie, which she managed to maintain with a mastery that Daniel deeply respected. However, in recent months, he has started to notice small changes. Clara seemed more distant at home, her phone vibrated more often than before, and she occasionally got lost in thought during dinner. Daniel attributed this to the stress of work, something she has always faced with strength. But there was something different now, something he couldn't name. Meanwhile, Daniel faced his own dilemmas at work. He was seen as one of the pillars of his team, a reliable and dedicated professional. But stability also brought monotony. He found himself wondering if his life had become too predictable. Wake up, work, go home. The routine, which once seemed safe, now suffocated him in a way he had never felt before. He wanted to change, but he didn't know how or where to start. The relationship with Clara also began to reflect this feeling of uncertainty. Dialogues that were previously long and full of meaning were now brief and functional. "How was your day?" followed by short, monosyllabic answers. There were still moments of affection, like when Clara held her hand while they watched a movie, or when Daniel prepared breakfast for her on the weekends. But these gestures seemed mechanical, like a silent obligation to keep up appearances. They both felt the weight of something they hadn't said out loud. The company where Clara worked held frequent meetings with the executive team, meetings that often lasted hours. Daniel knew these meetings were part of her job, but in recent months, there seemed to be more of them. Clara always returned late, often bringing documents to review at home. "It's just tight deadlines," she said, as she organized papers on the dining table. Daniel believed, or at least tried to believe. He knew how dedicated she was to her career, and he admired that about her. But the emotional distance between them grew every day, something he didn't know how to overcome. Clara, on the other hand, struggled with her own thoughts. "There were days when I felt overwhelming guilt, as if I were carrying a weight that no one else could see." She knew Daniel was a good man, someone who was always there for her, even when things got difficult. But sometimes she wondered if that was enough. If the love they had was strong enough to survive the changes that life brought. The environment at the company where Clara worked was competitive, full of egos and strong personalities. A place where any weakness could be exploited. However, she learned to navigate this environment, building a solid reputation. One of the biggest challenges, however, was dealing with the boss, a charismatic and influential man, who knew exactly how to manipulate the people around him. He had an unsettling ability to make anyone feel special, a trait that Clara, in moments of emotional exhaustion, could not ignore. However, she never mentioned her boss at home. Whenever Daniel asked about work, she responded vaguely, quickly changing the subject. He noticed, but didn't insist. Daniel didn't want to be that husband who doubts everything, who controls every detail of his wife's life. He trusted her. Or at least, I wanted to trust. At that point, their marriage seemed on a tightrope. They both knew something was wrong, but neither had the courage to address the issue directly. It was easier to pretend that everything was fine, to follow the routine, to keep up appearances. But deep down, they both knew that the truth would eventually come out. And when it came, it would change everything. The days following the fateful meeting began like any other in Daniel and Clara's lives, but the silence that now hung between them had an almost tangible weight. Daniel, who was never one to observe the nuances of routine, began to notice details that had previously escaped his attention. Clara seemed more meticulous than ever, checking her phone more frequently, adjusting her posture when listening to notifications and maintaining conversations that, at the slightest sign of her presence, became interrupted or brief. There was something different about her, a restlessness that Daniel tried to justify as a reflection of stress at work, but which increasingly seemed to be something more than that. He spent his nights on the couch, pretending to watch television while his mind wandered. The once predictable routine, which had once brought a sense of security, now seemed like an oppressive cycle. The house was impeccably tidy, as if Clara was using organization to mask the chaos that he suspected existed within it. But the small changes were impossible to ignore. The way she avoided his eyes, how her work excuses seemed mechanized, almost rehearsed, like poorly staged theater. Daniel felt more and more that something was out of place, but he still hesitated to confront her. Part of him wanted to believe it was paranoia, that his instinct was wrong, that the woman he loved was still the same. Clara, on the other hand, was experiencing a whirlwind of emotions. While Daniel clung to routine to try to find stability, she felt herself sinking into a sea of internal conflict. Every time she looked at his face, guilt overwhelmed her. He didn't deserve this, she knew. But there was something that pulled her away, a need that she couldn't explain, an abyss that she tried to fill with excuses that, deep down, she knew were fragile. The boss, with his persuasive manner and engaging charisma, seemed to have the power to deconstruct all his barriers. He made her feel seen, wanted, in a way she hadn't felt in a long time, and it terrified her as much as it attracted her. Hours at work became a mix of anticipation and guilt. Clara knew she was crossing a fine line, but every smile from her boss, every comment that seemed loaded with implied intentions, pulled her closer to a limit she wasn't sure she wanted or could respect. The closed-door meetings, which had previously been just a part of the job, now carried a palpable tension, a game of glances that Clara feared others might notice. The boss, in turn, seemed to be in control, as if he knew exactly how far he could go before something irremediable happened. At home, things were no better. The conversations between Clara and Daniel had become short, almost formal. Daniel tried to maintain normality, but his efforts were always met with lukewarm or disinterested responses. Clara avoided his eyes, as if afraid he might see what was going on in her mind. Daniel, in turn, felt increasingly invisible. He started working late, not because it was necessary, but because the silence at home was unbearable. The nights they used to share stories about their days had been replaced by quick meals and the muffled sound of notifications on her phone. The distance between them seemed to grow every day. Daniel began to feel that no matter how hard he tried, nothing would be enough to get back what they had. He remembered their first years together, the days when they couldn't wait to share their lives, and he couldn't understand how everything had deteriorated so quickly. His mind wandered in search of answers, reliving moments and trying to find where everything had started to go wrong. But the answer always seemed to slip through his fingers, leaving only a feeling of emptiness. Clara, on the other hand, oscillated between the desire to confess everything and the fear of losing everything. She knew she was on a dangerous path, but every interaction with her boss seemed to fuel her in a way she couldn't resist. He was everything Daniel wasn't at that moment, unpredictable, exciting, a vibrant contrast to the gray routine she associated with marriage. But she also knew that this fascination had a price she feared they were both about to pay. It was on a Friday afternoon that everything started to fall apart. Daniel, who rarely went to Clara's company, decided to surprise her. He bought a bouquet of flowers, a simple gesture that seemed to be his last attempt to rekindle something he felt was fading. He arrived at reception and asked to speak to Clara, but the receptionist, visibly disconcerted, said she was in a closed-door meeting. Daniel, with a smile that masked his anxiety, decided to wait. Time passed, but something in the receptionist's expression didn't make him feel comfortable. He saw his reflection in the glass of the doors and felt a pang of insecurity. After a few minutes, the doors opened, and Clara came out. I wasn't alone. Next to her was her boss, who was laughing at something she had said, while she was adjusting her blouse in an almost nervous manner. They stopped abruptly when they saw Daniel there, holding the bouquet. Clara's eyes widened, and the boss's smile disappeared almost instantly. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Daniel, with his heart racing and his stomach churning, handed the bouquet to Clara. I thought maybe we needed some color in our lives, he said, trying to mask the flood of emotions that consumed him. Clara took the flowers, but her hands were shaking. The boss, who until then had maintained a neutral expression, approached and shook Daniel's hand, introducing himself with a friendly tone. But Daniel didn't listen. His mind was focused on the details: Clara's gaze, the uncomfortable tone of her voice, the way she held the flowers as if they were an unbearable weight. When he left there, Daniel couldn't ignore the feeling that he had witnessed something that he still didn't fully understand. He began to connect the dots: the nights Clara came home late, the messages she never explained, the growing distance between them. Betrayal was no longer a vague assumption in his mind. She was there, among them, like a ghost that could no longer be ignored. That night, Clara arrived home later than usual. Daniel waited in the living room, sitting on the sofa, with a glass of whiskey in his hand. When she entered, he stared at her, without saying a word. Clara, who always knew how to use words, remained silent. The weight of what was to come was unbearable, and they both knew that nothing would be the same after that moment. The tension in the room was suffocating. Daniel felt the weight of his newfound betrayal as he stared at Clara, who, sitting in front of him, held her hands together as if that could contain the tremor that was taking her over. The silence that followed the confrontation seemed to last an eternity. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but his voice was sharp when he finally broke the silence. He wanted explanations, answers, something that could at least make sense of the chaos that had settled into his life. Clara tried to begin, but each attempt was interrupted by her own inability to form a coherent sentence. I never wanted it to go this far, she said finally, her voice breaking mid-word. Daniel laughed, but the sound was dry, without any humor. He shook his head and rubbed his face with his hands, trying to contain the fury building inside him. So far, he repeated, his voice now thick with disbelief. Clara, so far away that I have no idea who you are now. Who is this person who lied to me, who blatantly betrayed me? So far away that I wonder what, besides humiliation, is left for me. Clara looked up at him, and the weight of guilt in her gaze was almost unbearable. I know I was wrong, Daniel. I know what I did. But it wasn't just what it seemed. It was more than that, and less at the same time. His voice shook, but Daniel had no patience for his ambiguities. Less. More. Are you trying to justify this now? Because, Clara, what you did is unjustifiable. I trusted you, I dedicated my life to building something with you, and you destroyed everything for what? For fun. Clara lowered her head, tears silently rolling down her face. But Daniel wasn't finished. He needed her to feel the weight of his words, to understand how much her actions had devastated him. You don't understand, do you? It's not just the betrayal. It's the fact that you looked into my eyes every day, pretending everything was fine, while hiding it. You let me believe that the problem was me, that it wasn't enough when all this was going on. She took a deep breath, trying to regain some control over her emotions. I know I lied, Daniel. I know I hurt you. But you need to listen. You need to know the truth, because there's something you don't know. Something that will change how you see this. His voice was tense, almost desperate, and Daniel backed away slightly, confused. What else can there be, Clara? What else can you tell me that would make this worse or better? You betrayed me. What can change that? Clara hesitated, as if what she was about to say required all the courage she possessed. His eyes sought Daniel's, but he looked away, unable to face the weight of the moment. It was him, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the boss who manipulated everything, from the beginning. He involved me, used me, and this wasn't just about me, Daniel. It was about you. Daniel stood still, his eyebrows furrowed as he tried to understand what she was saying. About me, he repeated, confusion evident in his voice. Clara nodded slowly, her breathing ragged. He knew about you, about your work, your position, your connections. He approached me not just because, out of attraction, but because he wanted something. He wanted information. He wanted to use it against you. The impact of Clara's words hit Daniel like a blow. He leaned forward, eyes wide, trying to process what he had just heard. Are you telling me this was all a plan? That he approached you to, what? Sabotage my career? Undermine my life? Clara shook her head, tears still streaming down her face. I didn't know at first, Daniel. I swear I didn't know. He started in such a subtle way, making me feel special, listening to me, supporting me when I felt lost. And when I realized he had other intentions, I was already too involved to get out without consequences. He knew that. He knew exactly how to arrest me. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat, a mixture of anger, pain and disbelief. He stood up, pacing back and forth, trying to find a way out of the whirlwind of emotions that consumed him. And you? He asked finally, turning to Clara with a hard look. Did you know all of this and continue? Did you continue because what? Did he threaten you? Or did you just choose to ignore it because you were fascinated by him? Clara flinched at the tone of his voice, but knew she couldn't back down now. I felt trapped, Daniel. He knew things about me, about us. He made me believe that if I said something or stopped, it would hurt you. That he had the power to destroy more than our marriage. And I was scared of losing everything. Daniel laughed again, but this time there was something almost manic in his expression. Fear. Fear of losing everything. Clara, you've already lost everything. You lost me, you lost our trust, you lost the chance to be a team against anything the world threw at us. You chose to deal with this alone, and look where it got us. The silence that followed was broken only by their heavy breathing. Clara desperately wanted to find a way to make things right, but she knew that some wounds couldn't be healed. Daniel, on the other hand, felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under his feet. What was left now? What could he do with the truths he had just discovered? As the hours passed and the house fell into an uneasy silence, Daniel knew a decision needed to be made. What would he do with all this? And Clara, now alone with her thoughts, felt the weight of the choices that had led her there. Their fate, previously intertwined, now seemed to hang by a thread, on the edge of an abyss impossible to ignore. Daniel couldn't sleep that night. His mind ran in circles, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of revelations and emotions that had consumed him. The room was plunged into darkness, but his mind was more active than ever, every detail of Clara's confession pulsing in his head like an open wound. He needed to understand, he needed to confront it head-on. But there was a limit to how much he could process at once. He got up from the sofa, feeling the weight of each step as he climbed the stairs towards the bedroom. When he opened the door, Clara was sitting on the bed, hugging her knees. She turned her face to him, her gaze tired and full of fear. He stopped in the middle of the room, his voice low, but carrying a firm tone that Clara couldn't ignore. You owe me more than vague explanations, Clara. I want to know everything. I want to know how far this went, what you told him, what he knows about me. If I'm going to understand this, I need the truth. The whole truth. Clara pursed her lips, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to formulate a response. I knew there was no easy way out, that omitting any details now would only make things even worse. He knew about the project you were working on, Daniel. About that important negotiation with the investors. He knew you were a key player, that if he could undermine your credibility or leak confidential information, it could destabilize the company and strengthen his position in the market. Daniel took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. What about you? Did you give him this information, Clara? Did you do it for him? She shook her head quickly, her voice now filled with despair. No, not like that. He asked me things, he made it seem like they were innocent questions about the work environment, about his routine, but I realized he was putting together a puzzle. I never directly delivered anything, I never wanted to harm you, but I know he used what he could get from me. And I was weak. I allowed it. Daniel felt the blood boil in his veins. He began to pace the room, footsteps echoing on the floor as he tried to maintain control. You didn't just allow it, Clara. You became an accomplice, whether by choice or neglect. He used you, and you let it happen. While I was here, trusting you, thinking we were facing the difficulties together, you were fueling the man who wanted to destroy everything we built. Clara got up from the bed, tears now streaming freely down her face. Do you think I don't see that, Daniel? That I don't hate myself for it? He manipulated me, yes, but I should have been stronger. I should have protected you. I don't know how to fix this, but I would do anything to have another chance, to make things right. Daniel stopped, looking at her. And you think that's enough? That only regret can erase everything? Clara, I loved you. I trusted you. But now, I don't even know who you are. I don't know if I can even look at you without remembering what had happened. You destroyed more than our marriage. You destroyed the person I was. The silence between them was suffocating, each word still hanging in the air like an unbearable weight. Clara tried to take a step towards him, but Daniel raised his hand, indicating for her to stop. No. I need time, Clara. I need distance. I can't stay here now. He left the room, grabbing a backpack with some clothes and his keys. Clara followed him to the door, trying to convince him to stay, but he didn't look back. When he closed the door behind him, he felt the cold night air hit his face, an almost numbing sensation. He drove aimlessly for hours, the deserted streets seeming like a reflection of the emptiness he felt inside. Meanwhile, Clara remained sitting in the living room, her tears drying as guilt and despair took over her being. She knew that there were no excuses that could erase what she had done, but she also knew that she couldn't just give up. She needed to find a way to deal with the consequences, to face the choices that led her there. Daniel finally stopped the car in front of a small hotel. He entered without paying much attention to his surroundings, just wanting a place to think. Sitting on the bed in his room, his head in his hands, he began to reevaluate everything he knew. It wasn't just the emotional or physical betrayal, it was a blow to his professional life, his confidence, his vision of the world. He wondered how he had let everything get to this point without realizing it. Clara's words echoed in his mind, every detail of her confession increasing the feeling of betrayal. The next morning he made a decision. If Clara was right, if her boss really was using information to harm him, Daniel needed to act. He knew he couldn't trust her anymore, but he also knew he had to protect himself. He returned home, still early, and found Clara in the kitchen, the sunken eyes of someone who hadn't slept. She looked at him, surprised and apprehensive, but said nothing. I will fight, he said, voice firm. Not just for what's right, but to make sure he doesn't have the chance to ruin my life even more. And you, Clara, are going to help me. Not because I want you to make amends for what you've done, but because it's the least you can do it now. Clara nodded slowly, knowing it was her last opportunity to show that she was willing to face the consequences of her actions. Daniel knew he was far from forgiving her, but at that moment, he needed clarity, focus. The road ahead would be arduous, but he was determined to regain control of his life, whatever the cost. And Clara, consumed by the weight of her guilt, knew that she would have to face every step alongside him, even if it meant carrying the burden of her choices for the rest of her life. The morning seemed to appear more slowly in that house, as if the sun hesitated to illuminate a space so full of tension. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-finished coffee in front of him, while Clara remained standing, leaning against the counter, her hands crossed as if she were trying to anchor herself to the reality that was collapsing around her. He barely looked at her. It wasn't because of disinterest or indifference, but because every time his eyes met hers, a whirlwind of conflicting memories and emotions swallowed him. It still hurt too much, it still seemed impossible to process everything that had been revealed. But he knew the next step was inevitable. "You said he knows a lot about me," Daniel began, his voice dry but controlled. "What exactly does he know?" "I want details, Clara. I want to understand how far this went, because that's what will determine what I do next." His words sounded more like an interrogation than a conversation. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath before responding. He knew he could no longer hide behind half-truths. "He knows about the projects you led, especially that big international contract. He used seemingly harmless questions to get information. And I never thought he would use it against you, but now I realize he set it up as a puzzle." Daniel leaned forward, crossing his arms on the table. "And do you think he's already done anything with this information? Has he put anything into practice?" Clara hesitated, her voice wavering as she responded. "I don't know, Daniel. But knowing him as I do now, I think it's possible. He's calculating, he doesn't make moves in vain." Daniel shook his head, feeling the frustration rising again. "Of course it's possible. He played with you and, by extension, with me. And now, I'm in the middle of a time bomb without knowing when it's going to explode." That uncomfortable silence returned, heavy as ever. Clara wanted to say more, she wanted to find words that showed that she was there to help, that she wanted to fix what she could. But Daniel's presence, so serious, so different from the man she knew, left her adrift. He, on the other hand, struggled to stay focused. He knew he couldn't get lost in emotional discussions at that moment, that he needed to be strategic. Still, it was difficult to ignore the weight of what it represented in his life. Throughout the day, Daniel began to make a plan. He knew that facing Clara's boss directly would be pointless without concrete proof. He needed something to support his position, something that could neutralize any attempted attack against him. He felt exhausted just thinking about all the possibilities, but he had no choice. Clara, realizing that Daniel would not include her in the details, decided to act on her own. She knew it was risky, but she felt like she owed it to him. It wasn't just about saving the marriage or repairing lost trust, it was about doing what was right after making so many wrong choices. While Daniel spent hours on the phone, talking to trusted contacts and trying to identify possible loopholes, Clara decided to confront her boss. She knew he would deny any accusations, but she wanted him to know that she was no longer under his control. As she entered the office, she felt his gaze pass through her, as if he were measuring what she knew and how far she could go. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm, but her heart was beating fast. He smiled, that calculated smile she had learned to hate. "Of course, Clara. We always have time for you." The confrontation was tense. She laid everything out on the table, every manipulation, every veiled threat he had made over the months. He listened calmly, without denying, without confirming. "You're being melodramatic," he said finally, with a calmness that only intensified her anger. "You think you know how to play, Clara, but you have no idea how the game actually works. And if you were smart, you'd know that the best thing for you is to keep things as they are." That was enough for Clara to understand that he was not only willing to continue, but that he felt untouchable. She left there determined to find another way to take him down. When he returned home, he found Daniel still in the middle of his investigations. He looked at her briefly, but didn't ask where she had been. Maybe he already knew, or maybe he just didn't care at that moment. She sat on the couch, watching him as he spoke on the phone, his expression serious, his every movement carrying the tension of what was to come. Clara wanted to offer something more, but knew that any attempt could be seen as intrusion. Finally, Daniel hung up the phone and looked at her. "I have a plan," he said, his voice even colder than before. "But for this to work, I need to know if you're willing to do your part. And when I say do your part, I mean really commit, because any slip-up and all of this goes down the drain." Clara nodded, without hesitation. "I'll do whatever it takes, Daniel. You just need to tell me what to do." He watched her for a long moment, as if trying to decide if he could trust her again. "Very well," he said finally. "But know that if this fails, there will be nothing left between us but ruins." The plan involved Clara acting as a decoy, recording conversations with her boss and trying to obtain concrete evidence of his intentions and actions. It was a huge risk, but she knew it was necessary. Daniel worked behind the scenes, coordinating the next steps and ensuring that when the time was right, everything was aligned. It was a dangerous game, but he was determined to emerge victorious. The following days were a test of nerves. Clara returned to work, feigning normalcy as she tried to extract information from her boss without arousing suspicion. Daniel, on the other hand, monitored everything from a distance, with the help of a trusted friend who had experience in delicate situations like that. It was a careful dance, and they both knew that any false step could be disastrous. At the end of an exhausting week, Clara got what she needed. A recording where his boss admitted not only his intentions to harm Daniel, but also other unethical practices that could destroy him if they came to light. When he handed Daniel the evidence, he saw something in his eyes that he hadn't seen in weeks, a glimmer of relief, maybe even hope. But he was still cautious. "This is a start," he said, analyzing the material. "But it's not enough to end this for good. We still need to do more." Clara knew that the road ahead would still be long. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was taking steps in the right direction. And Daniel, although he still carried the weight of betrayal, began to see a possibility of rebuilding not only his life, but perhaps, over time, even something between them. What remained now was to face the last and most difficult obstacle, exposing the truth in a way that no one could deny. And for that, they would need all the strength and courage they had left. The weeks that followed were like walking a tightrope, each day bringing a new challenge and increasing weight. Daniel was determined to complete the plan he had devised, but the tension was almost unbearable. He knew that Clara had put herself at risk by recording the conversations with her boss, but he still couldn't put aside his hurt and distrust. He was focused on one thing, making sure the man who tried to destroy his life faced the consequences of his actions. Clara's betrayal was a chapter he still couldn't close, but for now, his energy was focused on ensuring justice was done. The evidence gathered by Clara was devastating. Not only had her boss used confidential information to try to sabotage Daniel's career, he was also involved in a series of irregularities within the company, including financial fraud and contract manipulation. Daniel knew that, with the right material and the right legal support, he could take him down once and for all. But I didn't want to act impulsively. He would need allies, strategy and impeccable execution. With the help of a lawyer friend, Daniel presented the evidence to the board of directors of the company where Clara worked. The reaction was explosive. The boss, who had always maintained an untouchable stance, was confronted in an emergency meeting. Initially, he tried to deny it, ridiculing the accusations, but when the recordings were played and documents presented, his facade began to crumble. The expression of arrogance gave way to panic. He tried to argue, suggesting it was all a setup, but the evidence was incontrovertible. His career, carefully built on manipulation and control, began to crumble before his eyes. Clara was present at the meeting, her heart racing as she watched the man who had manipulated her try to cling to any scrap of power. She felt no relief or satisfaction, just emptiness. I knew I was witnessing the end of something big, but I also knew that I still had my own demons to deal with. When the meeting ended and her boss was escorted out of the building, she felt a mixture of triumph and despair. It was closure, but not the end. Daniel, in turn, observed everything from the outside. I did not want to be present at the meeting, preferring to give Clara the necessary space to face that situation alone. He found her later, outside the building. She was visibly shaken, but there was a firmness in her expression that he hadn't seen in a while. "He's finished," she said, her voice low but carrying a resolve she hadn't shown before. Daniel nodded but didn't respond. There was something about him that Clara couldn't decipher, a barrier that she feared would never be broken. In the following days, the chief's downfall became public. The media reported on the scandal, and he faced not only the loss of his position, but also legal proceedings that could result in severe penalties. The company, trying to repair its image, acted quickly to restructure its leadership and ensure that practices like these would never again be tolerated. Clara remained with the company, but her position was now delicate. Although she had been instrumental in exposing the crimes, she knew that many still viewed her with suspicion. He decided he needed a fresh start, away from that environment that now held so many painful memories. Daniel, on the other hand, felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. But the void left by the betrayal was still crushing. He didn't know if he could forgive Clara, if it was possible to rebuild something after everything that had happened. They had many conversations over the following weeks, but none seemed to bring a clear solution. Clara made a point of making it clear that she was willing to fight for them, but she also knew that she couldn't force him to do anything. "If you decide that you can no longer look at me without remembering what happened, I will understand," she said in one of their last conversations. "But I want you to know that no matter what happens, I will never stop regretting destroying what we had." Daniel heard those words, but didn't respond immediately. He knew he couldn't make an impulsive decision, that he needed time to understand what he really wanted. During this period, he began to dedicate more time to himself, taking up hobbies he had put aside and reconnecting with friends he hadn't seen in years. Little by little, he realized that there was life beyond the pain, that it was possible to find purpose again, even if in a different way than he imagined. Clara, in turn, also began to rebuild her life. She decided to change jobs, looking for something that challenged her, but also brought a sense of purpose. Although he still loved Daniel, he knew he needed to find his own strength, something that didn't depend solely on him. The lonely nights were difficult, but they were also a time of deep reflection. She began to understand not only the mistakes she had made, but also the choices that led her to that point. The distance between them ended up becoming a form of healing. Although they weren't together like before, their conversations became less tense and more honest. They both knew the future was uncertain, but they were beginning to accept that no matter what happened, they needed to find peace with themselves first. Months later, Daniel met someone who brought new light into his life. It wasn't something immediate or overwhelming, but a feeling that grew over time, bringing him hope that it was possible to love again. Clara found out and, although her heart hurt, she felt it was the best thing for him. She also found a new beginning, not in a relationship, but in a life she built based on her own choices, learning to value the freedom that once seemed daunting. Their stories followed different paths, but each found their own form of redemption. The boss, on the other hand, faced the full weight of his choices, watching his career and reputation dissolve like smoke. In the end, the consequences found everyone, each in their own way. And although the past could not be erased, both Daniel and Clara learned that true forgiveness begins within oneself. If you've made it this far, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Share your opinion in the comments, as it is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And remember, cheating is never justified. Thanks for following us and see you next time.